Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by my two Tontos, Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey, get ready to be canceled.
Does that make you the Lone Ranger?
Yep, there's Tonto 1 and Tonto 2. Today we are concluding our discussion of The Disaster Tourist, the first book in our series, Rich Country, Poor Country. If this is your first time joining us, we are also on Reddit at r/canonicalpod and on social media at canonicalpod. Next week, we will continue our series with a review of Viet Nguyen's The Sympathizer. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well.
So, spoiler warning. In this episode, I want to talk about some other Korean entertainment, specifically Squid Game and Parasite.
K-pop.
Maybe a little K-pop at the end, but just to be forewarned, there will probably be some spoilers. So check out those two before you listen. They are both really good.
Are they BTS good, though?
Maybe even better than BTS. Maybe.
What?
I see some resemblance in the political attitude of The Disaster Tourist and the other two Korean productions, 2021's Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk, and 2019's Parasite, directed by Bong Joon-ho. I think that there are some broad similarities. What do you think is going on in these?
Well, Squid Game feels very over the top anti-capital in how you have this dehumanizing way of pitting people against each other for money, even though it's likely that they're going to die in the process because they are so desperate for that money that they'll do just about anything to get it.
Well, and there's also the elite who control everything.
Right.
I think that all three works are showing us what poverty does to human beings. And I think that in Parasite, the focus is more on inequality. But what we see in Parasite, I think, is really focused on Korea and Korean society. Whereas this novel, I think, is a little bit more global, only because it's written by a Korean writer, but about things not happening in Korea. In that sense, the global perspective, it seems to me more like what I see from the American left, which I think is not as concerned with America specifically anymore as they are with the entire world. I think in Squid Game, it is much more about poverty specifically because these people are willing to do something that has a very, very small chance of success. And the reason why they're willing to participate is because even this large chance of death is still better to them than the prospect of living a life without money. That equation that they're running in their minds is central to the TV series. What do people do when they're pushed to the edge? In this novel, people may not have been pushed to the edge, but the people on Mui have always kind of existed on the edges of the industrialized world or the edges of the world that Korean people live in. Inequality, I do think, is the recurring theme in all of these works. It's possibly because of a change in values. There is a world values survey, I think every 5 years or so. And in the survey, very few people in Korea reported that they thought incomes should be made more equal. But more and more people are saying now that they feel conflicted about income inequality. So, is this novel conflicted, or is it something that has already made the decision that income should be more equal?
I don't see it as being very conflicted. I think it's pretty stridently anti-elite, anti-capitalist, anti-exploitation of poor people.
I think I agree, but I don't know that it's saying anything about like wages specifically, but it is very anti-capital.
I would say that, James, in your statement there, you have revealed kind of your own perspective because you're talking about people not having the same amount of income, and you're saying that's the same thing as them being exploited. Do you think that the novel treats this as the same, or is this just your own perspective?
Would you say that they are not being exploited? It seems pretty clear that they are being exploited because they're poor. They must sacrifice themselves, like literally, they must sacrifice their lives in order to bring tourists to the island. It seems to me that that's a form of exploitation because this situation has been established either by the system of tourism or by Paul.
That to me is clear, but I guess my question is, does the novel offer incomes being made more equal as the solution to that problem?
Oh, I see what you mean. No, I think it's not explicitly stated, but it's pretty clear if you read the book that the people who are taking these trips are wealthier.
Right. Privileged people.
Yeah, they're more privileged. And I suppose you could say that perhaps there's some generational wealth and it's not income per se, but obviously there's a difference in capital and well being that allows one group of people to travel to a place like Mui and enjoy themselves because of what the other group of people have to do, which is to kill themselves and create this kind of false tourist trap, I guess, this false allure.
Yeah, I don't know that it presents a solution as much as it presents the problem.
The reason why I ask is because I think, different from Parasite and Squid Game, a lot of what happens politically in terms of the ideas in this novel happen off of the page. I think what she does is she presents a situation for us that has political implications, but she is not direct about kind of exploring what those implications are. She leaves that to the reader. For me, I think that I am more conflicted than certain that incomes should be made more equal. And I'm just wondering, when I read this novel and react to it the way that I do, is my reaction based more on my own politics or something in the novel?
Hmm.
To clarify, your reading is that she is conflicted about income inequality.
I don't think she has either to say, really. I think that she offers a situation where, any person with half a brain can see that this is about inequality. But she doesn't tell you how to feel about that. I come to a conclusion that I feel conflicted. And I'm wondering if that's because I am conflicted personally or if it's something in the novel. When I watch Parasite or when I watch Squid Game, it's quite different. When I watch Squid Game, I feel very clearly that a more direct message is being sent.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think there's anything in this book that is directly leading to that conflicted stance. I feel like that might be something that you're bringing to the book. To me, this book, if it's saying anything at all about this topic, wants to do away with this system just completely. And yet, at the end of the book, we still return to a tourism based on disaster anyway.
Yeah, for me, it's pretty clear, but I think what is clear is not income specifically, but this power system in place. That's really clear. And I think income is like one of the pillars that, hold up or create the system.
When I say that it's happening off the page and it's not saying anything specific, I don't mean it as a criticism of the novel. In fact, I think it's one of the virtues of the novel. We talked in the first episode how I didn't see any specific villain in the novel. And that to me, I think, is done very well. In contrast to Squid Game, you have this kind of cabal of elites who come to watch human misery in person and have orgies and just kind of enjoy human suffering. That's entertaining, but it's also very cartoonish. It's an exaggeration. In this novel, what I found most interesting is Paul, this kind of faceless corporation that's everywhere, and it's kind of humanized, or it's meant to be humanized by giving it a first name, but nobody knows what Paul is. It's this kind of exaggerated, I don't know how to express it, but I think that a lot of like these global conglomerates, they try to portray this kind of caring human face, but in fact they're not. In the commercials for, Philip Morris or whatever the new name for Philip Morris is, they have happy smiling people, but they're not. You see any commercial for whatever company it is, and the way they portray themselves is very human, very opposite from the way they are.
I get what you're saying, but I will say, and I was hinting at this in the first episode, that I felt like Paul was a clear villain. I agree with what you say about the name Paul making it more human, despite being this kind of amorphous, shadowy thing that we don't have a clear picture of. And that they take pains to make sure that no one person knows exactly what they're doing and thus cannot be held responsible. But I still get the sense that someone is pulling the strings, even though we don't see that person or that group.
I think maybe the difference is when I see Paul, yes, there are bad people doing bad things, but if it weren't Paul, it would have been any other corporation. So for me, my reading, and this again is probably something that I'm bringing to the novel, it's not in the novel itself, is that it's not Paul being bad specifically, but the system that creates Paul.
Mm.
Another point of comparison between these three is we're talking about kind of the maturity or the sophistication of their politics. And in some ways, I think this novel feels like the work of a young writer. So Yun published the novel in 2013, and at that time she was only 31 years old. On the other hand, Bong Joon-ho was 50, and likewise, Hwang Dong-hyuk was also 50 when Parasite and Squid Game were released. Sometimes I think that people unfairly associate leftist politics with youth as naivete. So you've kind of already heard my point of view, but do you think that the political statement being made in The Disaster Tourist is mature?
God, I hate when you put it that way. I
Is it the word mature?
Sam doesn't like a mature.
no, it's I mean, I know you've made it clear this is not your perspective that sometimes people unfairly associate leftist politics this way. This book to me feels naive, but it doesn't feel immature. But I feel like those are two separate things that I'm talking about. I think that what feels naive to me in this book is the way it's written, not the perspective per se. So it's not her politics. I think her politics are fine. I take issue with the mature versus immature because I think that, as you already set up with the premise, I think that's a false premise.
Well, if we use the word sophisticated or nuanced as a stand in for mature, does that change it?
A little. I don't think she's very nuanced. That's very different from your original question because I don't think she's very nuanced, but I don't have a problem with her political point of view.
Well, I think I said this in the review, which is that I think she definitely has a point of view and a worldview, and I think she has ideas, but I don't think they're very considered. I don't think she brings anything especially new to this discussion because she's presenting inequality, this unfair system, the capitalist system, the tourism economy that exploits people. Like all of that is not especially new. So because of that, it's not especially sophisticated. I'll amend it. I'll say because it's not especially considered, which makes it not very sophisticated. Because I think when I say something feels new, what I mean is they're considering this idea or this worldview or this problem, and they're presenting it in a way that's fresh or interesting or more nuanced. But she's not.
The thing that I think she tried to do, which I think is perhaps more sophisticated, is the way that she wanted to link the sexual harassment in the beginning of the novel with the exploitation that we see in the end of the novel. That to me, I think, is an interesting idea, but it felt immature. And here I'll go back to that word immature because the way that she handled the sexual harassment incident felt very schematic. I thought that she was just imagining the situation rather than drawing on any personal or life experience. She was creating a schema of what happens when women are sexually harassed in the workplace based on media reports rather than any kind of real experience that she had or a real serious investigation of these ideas and these experiences. I felt the same way about the romantic relationship between Yona and Luck on the island. I think that what she was trying to do, again, I think her motives were good. I think she was trying to explore the boundaries between the personal and the political by having this foreign woman become attached to this local man. She wanted to see how that would complicate her response to the subjugation of the people on this island. But she didn't execute it well. She didn't really explore the interaction between the mixture of different nationalities and the power involved in the romantic relationship.
I remember early on in this novel that I wondered if that schematic feeling was due to cultural difference, but I think I agree. I feel like a lot of Yona's actions felt schematic to me, so much so that I was constantly reminding myself to suspend disbelief, that it was all in service to this greater point that Yoon had. But I felt that having to remind myself constantly like that lessened the impact of that greater point. We have recently discussed this exact issue when we were talking about There But For The. In those episodes, we also referenced convenience store women, and I didn't feel that as an issue with convenience store women. But I get what you're saying here. I felt it throughout this novel.
Despite those elements feeling kind of immature, I do think that the other political aspects of the novel are, in fact, more elaborate than Parasite or Squid Game. This is what I had mentioned earlier at the top of the episode about how this novel is more globally concerned. I think those two are more specifically focused on Korea. And I think that what this novel does is it takes its examination of capitalism to the global scale, it elaborates further. But is it fair to say that taking things to that next step and making them more elaborate in that way makes them more mature?
I guess I just don't like this. Like, this is what Sam said earlier. I don't like this word mature because why does it matter if it's mature? Like, for me, what matters is that it's considered. That thought has been put into it and it's complex, like it's problematized. Like, that is what matters, right? Why is maturity important?
I use the word maturity because it has the presupposition that things will grow along certain lines and that given time, they will develop. So you could use the word developed instead, I suppose. It just has the added idea that in time, this development would happen. So if you're thinking about capitalism and the problems of capitalism, I think at some point along the line, you would think about how these problems exist not just inside one society or one country, but between countries. And that to me, I think, is the developed or mature aspect of this novel that I don't see in Squid Game or Parasite. But on the other hand, even though I think that context adds a lot, perhaps she is just taking her story somewhere that Squid Game and Parasite didn't want to go.
I think I come back to the same thing that James was just saying, that the full measure of consideration is what matters. And even if she's expanding on the capitalism to be this global context, because it's not explored all that deeply, I don't know that it is doing a better job than the other works you've mentioned. I don't know that it's more effective than either of those, just because it's broadening this to be a more global perspective.
I guess I'm mixed on this idea of the global perspective being the mature perspective. It's not that I disagree with you. I have to actually think about it. I can't even say I agree or disagree with you at the moment. But my first reaction to this is like, it feels like this is some kind of frame that you're putting onto a way of looking at these works. Like, I didn't look at these works and think to myself, what it really needs is a global perspective. And that's what will make this work more mature or developed. the direction I went was I actually compared it to another book that we read, Blindness. It also takes on these ideas of like structures of power and a little bit about capitalism as well, but more about like power structures and who has power and how power is wielded. And I would say that is a very considered handling of the topic. I would say it's fully explored. And it's different, of course, from these works, but it's just way more sophisticated. And for me, it's not really a maturity, even though I suppose he was probably older than these three artists. It's not maturity. I think it's just more development, more interiority, more sophistication and complexity in how the topic is developed over a linear plot. I mean, that's the problem with this book is that it feels so frazzled and mixed that you don't have space to develop these ideas. So I never found myself thinking what I really want is a global perspective. What I found myself wanting is the writer, Yoon, really drilling down and figuring out, well, what is it that she wants to say about this idea?
I'll turn your question a little bit on its head, Ed. Parasite and Squid Game were both pretty big deals internationally. I mean, Parasite won multiple Oscars, including Best Picture, right? Squid Game was watched by like more people than in the world that have watched anything, or some astronomical figure. If those things were just more focused on the Korean brand of capitalism, if you couldn't extrapolate from them, would they be that effective? Would they have been that popular? I think they were popular because even if they were limited hypothetically to Korea, I think they were popular because people could relate to them. People could expand for themselves outward. Whereas even though Yoon does that work for us in this novel, because it's not as effective as those others, I don't think it's going to have the same reach that Squid Game or Parasite do.
I think you're right that those two works have a reach because the audience is able to see something in the work and connect it to their own lives, even though it's not specifically globalized. What I'm looking for is not really that kind of emotional connection that people have when they look at these people suffering in Squid Game and they say, oh, American society is quite like that as well. But rather, it's not an emotional content, it's a more explicit political content where this novel, I think, is more specifically saying that global capitalism spreads problems from country to country because they are globalized.
Mm.
That content, I think, is not an emotional thing, but rather a specific intellectual thing. And I'm not sure that this is something that we really differ on, but rather when we talk about these different experiences, I think what James is talking about is that he wants depth from a novel. And I think depth is also very valuable, but breadth is also valuable. And in the discussion of capitalism and its problems, when you leave out this global aspect, it's not broad enough. And it feels like something is missing. Maybe not to James, but to me and perhaps others. When you talk about the problems of capitalism and you don't talk about this aspect, I would feel like something is missing.
Yeah, I don't want to harp on her. We've already talked about the deficiency of this book quite a bit, but I feel like breadth is important. But if it's all surface level, that breadth doesn't have a whole lot of value. Like there has to be some modicum of depth, even if you're reaching for something broad.
So, another thing that I have been talking about a lot on this podcast is my idea of a globalized middle class set of values. I think that this is something that is continuously emerging in our lifetimes. And one of the analyses of Korean attitudes towards capitalism really stood out to me in light of this idea. The article is talking about a book called Measured Excess. In that book, Laura Nelson finds that the shared sense of deprivation following the Korean War and the post war period had a leveling effect on society. No one was well to do, so class distinctions and divisions were insignificant. Likewise, in the 1970s, the structure of the economy was such that the levels of consumption were relatively equal because demand was low across the board. But the growth of the domestic economy and an increase in the 1980s and 1990s brought forth new products and an increased demand for them that drove the rapid development of Korea's consumer market. This is kind of a history lesson that Nelson is offering us of Korean attitudes towards consumption. But then she continues to say, with the growth of the consumer market came a new source of dissatisfaction and social division. As consumption rose, so did social distinctions and class divisions. This to me, I think, is really interesting. Number one, because it accounts for this trend that I'm seeing in these anti capitalist attitudes in Korean media. But number two, because I think it invites a kind of comparison to America and American attitudes towards capitalism. Are we seeing something similar in the Korean trajectory and the trajectory that we see in post war America from the 1950s to the 1970s?
I can certainly see that same trajectory here, at least in popular culture. Since none of us were alive in that era, I have to rely on popular culture. But it certainly seems like post war America had that same kind of trajectory, going from this collective sense of, I don't want to say equality because that's not true, but that everyone white was in a similar spot for the most part. And then the consumer market came and really ramped things up, driving class divisions further.
So I think you can definitely draw a parallel between post-war US and post-Korean War Korea. But I think one thing I would caution against is this idea of a trajectory, being that history was this way and will progress in that way. Because in the US, the strongest labor movements were before World War One. So it's not as if labor suddenly woke up a couple of decades after World War Two. That's the sort of cautionary tale here, which is that labor was much stronger in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and then became much weaker during and after the war.
Labor did, but America had the kind of economic boom that was pushed from World War II. That was on the heels of the Depression. And so the industrialization of the war pushed 1950s America into this boom.
Well, I mean, the claim here is with the growth of the consumer market came a new source of dissatisfaction and social division. I mean, yes, that's true, but what I'm saying is that's not the only thing that causes dissatisfaction and social division. I mean, how can it be so that you have a post war boom and suddenly people are more class conscious when in fact people were much more class conscious like a century earlier without that boom? It seems like a very limited ahistorical understanding of how this works. Like, I mean, you had what, like over 1 million people in the Communist Party before World War II? How can this claim be true? This claim can't be exclusionary. That's what I'm saying. Like, you can't just say because of this, people become dissatisfied in their social division. What I'm saying is, okay, this is one parallel you can draw. And maybe it's academically valid, maybe it's not. I don't know. I have to like read the whole thing. Like I can't just read this article. I mean, this has to be like an economic study. But you can't just say that the growth of the consumer market inevitably leads to more awareness of class divisions.
I don't think that that's the argument that Nelson is making in this book. I think it's perhaps not even an argument as much as just kind of a document of the situation after it's happened. Certainly, there are other causes of social distinction and class division. But if we look at this one specific source, if we regard it as a source in Korean society and American society, would we be likewise fair to predict that in the future, the Korean left will become similar to what we see in the American left nowadays? Here, what I'm talking about is this emphasis on intersectionality, this emphasis on globalized critique rather than specifically American critique. this emphasis on righting historical wrongs, this emphasis on privileging deprivileged groups. Are all of these things going to come with it in the same way? Or is the prediction that those things will happen in Korea taking it a step too far?
That's a tough question, in part because Korea is largely a homogenous nation, whereas the US is not in any sense. So when you talk about intersectionality, that's tough for me to ascribe to a lot of other countries, Korea being one of them. Certainly, there are aspects of Korean society that you could connect to intersectionality. But for example, race would not be a big factor in that in Korean culture, I would think, anyway.
So it's hard for me to answer because I look at this kind of American left contemporary liberal ideology as kind of a in between step where you have people who are dissatisfied with the system, but they never go so far as to propose revolution seriously. And if you look at labor movements throughout history, I mean, if we're talking seriously about like societal change, then you have to talk about like what mass strikes, revolution. I mean, the contemporary left is like two steps down what like a long hallway toward that. So, I mean, for me, it's almost like, yeah, like maybe the first couple of steps is you realize, oh, hey, life is unfair because some people make more money and we shouldn't like that. Like, we should not accept this. But isn't this just like very far from actually righting any wrongs?
I don't think that it's necessarily that the American left is moving towards that, because in fact, I don't know that the American left will ever be able to do that. I think that the structure of global capitalism has kind of perfected itself to the point that there is no violent or direct political action that people can take specifically against it, because people are wage slaves, more or less. People cannot afford to take this kind of political action the way they could in the past.
I'll ask it another way. What this question is saying is with increasing consumption, people will become more class conscious, right?
Well, that's the quote from Nelson's book. I mean, I'm not sure if that is really true, but if it is true, and if it's true in Korea and true in America, are other things true of Korea and America at the same time?
It's so hard to say because it's just, for me, it's just a very limited statement. Like Sam said, there are cultural factors at play too. So I'll say right now, yes, with a question mark, because I think you could say that class consciousness leads to all these other ways of understanding the world, which come with this kind of capitalist middle class. And there's this kind of shared understanding of how the world works because we all live under the same capitalist system.
Well, that global capitalist system, or just the way that life is globalized nowadays, to me is what I think throws a wrench into this kind of idea of history progressing along this kind of track. Because modern social movements don't proceed in the same way as they did in the past, because of the internet specifically. If we look at Me Too, for example, Me Too didn't happen in one place first, it happened globally, almost simultaneously. And I think as things progress, more and more social movements are going to happen the same way. So I don't think that it's reasonable to continue expecting countries to follow the trajectories of other countries. I think that this trend will kind of vanish as we move forward.
Let's take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
So This anti capitalist trend that I'm seeing in Parasite, Squid Game, and The Disaster Tourist, is this good for Korean entertainment in general? Is this something that is going to fuel this Korean wave of entertainment, or is it potentially going to derail the momentum that they have?
I mean, you can participate in something while still being critical of it, as all three of these works point to. I don't think they will derail things.
I mean, Hollywood people are famously liberal, and yet they keep on producing these big budget movies and exploiting people.
So, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that liberals are exploitative as well as conservatives?
What I mean is, like, why would an anti capitalist trend derail the Korean wave? Like, how would that happen? This is where I go back to this idea of revolution. Like, are you talking about Soviet Russia, where you have to say, okay, all of this is bad capitalism. We're not going to do this anymore.
No. What I mean here by derailing the Korean wave is by turning audiences off of Korean entertainment products. This, I think, it harkens back to our discussion that we had in the previous series about Ali Smith's There But For The. James, you had said that a conservative reader wouldn't touch the novel. They would look at it and it just wouldn't make any sense to them as something that they would want to read. And that to me, I think, is something that we might predict coming from this trend if it continues further. Because now I think American politics, at least, are more and more polarized. And there is more and more content being produced that half of America won't touch. And I think the thing about the Korean wave, and specifically K pop, it is aggressively universal. It is made for everybody. And I don't think that K pop will be able to survive this kind of political message.
Do you think this book and Parasite and Squid Game, even though they do have leftist politics, do you think they exclude a conservative viewer? Because I don't think any of them do.
That is a very good question. And here I would love to have an actual conservative on the podcast to talk to. But I am really curious about that. Like you mentioned, Squid Game was enormously successful. It is, I think, the most watched thing on Netflix ever. So I'd imagine at least a few conservatives watched it. How did they react to it? If they liked it, is it because they didn't understand? Like, when conservatives get anti capitalist media, what are they going to do?
Well, for that one specifically, I think you can relate to the plight of the poor, even if you're conservative. I think you just don't take the next step, which is realize that the whole system is rigged
Yeah.
and people who are disadvantaged end up like the people who participate in Squid Game. But the thing is, in Squid Game, that's not explicit either. It's not saying that the system is rigged and if you're born in this class, you'll end up that way. I mean, it doesn't talk about that. It just says these are poor people and this is what they do to survive.
I count it as pretty obvious. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's pretty obvious what the political implications are. And I think that if conservatives can watch Squid Game and not see it as an attack on conservatism and attack on capitalism, then they are misunderstanding the work. And I think it is very, very difficult for an entertainment industry to be built on a huge segment of the population continuing to misunderstand their products. Like, I just don't think that's viable.
I mean, I don't really agree because I think if you just look at, I mean, I'm looking at American culture here. Look at like country music with Kid Rock. Like, none of us would ever listen to Kid Rock, but people do, right? Those values are totally, I wouldn't say they're antithetical, but they're just like dull for us. Like, we are uninterested in his topics, in his kind of music, but he makes a lot of money.
That's true, but I bet you Kid Rock's record label really wished that he were making that Taylor Swift money.
Yeah, but I mean, that's my point. It's like, yeah, you could make more money by being universal, but it's not like he's derailed, right? Like he's pretty successful. Or you pick like any kind of, I don't know, like Kendrick Lamar. There are a lot of people who are not listening to him. right?
Yeah.
Like his politics are clear, right? But it's not like he's been derailed. Like he's still wildly successful, makes a lot of money. I mean, sells a lot of records.
On the other hand, I mean, take it the other way. Yes, there's probably a lot of people that aren't listening to Kendrick Lamar, but there's also probably plenty of people that would not want anything to do with him personally, but probably love his music because, once again, hugely successful.
It's just the size of the pie, Like the American pie is so big, you get half of it, it's enough. So, yeah, you can be successful as Kid Rock getting the conservative slice of the pie, but in the past, you wouldn't have to divide it that way. You could get a huge piece.
What I'm saying is, I think there are some works that do slice the pie roughly in half. I think Kid Rock is definitely not getting half, but he appeals to half. However, and I know that there's some bias that I'm bringing to this, but I think that Kendrick Lamar does not appeal to half. I think that his appeal is much broader than half.
Okay.
In the same way that these other works that we were already discussing also have appeals beyond 50%. I think you're right in that you watch something like Squid Game and the politics are very, very clear. However, I think there is a lot that you can look past in an effort to be entertained and not even go into the ramifications, the greater meaning of it, and just go, oh man, this is messed up.
All right. Thank you for listening. We'll stop here. If you'd like to let us know what you think, you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be here with a review of Viet and Nguyen's The Sympathizer. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.